I'm Joe Helko, Director of Community Relations for Northwestern Counseling and Support Services, and welcome to another episode of NCSS Here for You. Since 1958, Northwestern Counseling and Support Services has been providing access to high-quality services which promote healthy living and emotional well-being to the residents of Franklin and Grand Isle counties. Over the years, as the needs of the community have changed, so too have the programs and services that we make available to assist children, adolescents, adults, families, and seniors. We take our role in the community seriously and strive to provide a continuum of the highest quality services to meet the needs of individuals who at any point seek assistance. The past legislative session saw NCSS and the designated mental health agency system of care, plus the Parent-Child Center Network, receive increased funding to address the workforce crisis and increased demands for services. Today, members of the NCSS Internal Legislative Committee join me to discuss successes, a look at future challenges, and to thank legislators for their support. To discuss the positive impact of the 2021-2022 legislative session, I am pleased to introduce this month's guests. They are Matt Habedank, who is the Children's Behavior Services Program Manager, Amy Johnson, Program Manager and Assistant Director of the Parent-Child Center of NCSS, Brady Therrien, who is Service Coordinator of the Community Rehabilitation and Treatment Program, and Tim Lyman, Quality Care Team Services Coordinator in the Developmental Services Division. So I want to welcome all of you back to part two of our discussion. And, now that we have reached the month of November, we're certainly into the election season as that will take place. So we continue our discussion, though, about all the great work that was done during the last session. So let's start off by, Matt, can you talk about the experiences that you had in testifying? Because we know that testifying this upcoming session is going to be very critically important as well.
Yeah, and testifying is every session for sure. And
yeah.
I will say, I testified once this session, which I always enjoy doing, but there was a huge amount of testimony that went on from people across the system, across multiple systems, that all, and kind of as we mentioned in the last episode, really it was very unified this session. Everyone was pulling in the same direction. And they weren't necessarily advocating for funding to all go in the same direction, but what they were laying out there in terms of need was very similar, so I think that helped an awful lot. I always like testifying. This session was a little bit different in that it was virtual. The testimony was virtual, so it was a lot more. I don't know. For me, I thought it was a lot more. It was simpler. There wasn't sort of the same pressure and dynamics of being in the, I don't know if you've ever been in those the committee rooms, but they're very small. There's often a lot of people in there. There's a lot of eyes on you, and just speaking into the computer was a little bit more. You had the opportunity to prepare everything word for word and sort of be very thoughtful about it. But that being said, both this year when I testified and every time really I have testified at the legislature, I find the committee members to be pretty engaged typically, and to very much want more information. I don't envy them their positions of having to make a lot of decisions about, especially funding for programs and agencies, and they have just a parade of folks that come in and out of those conference rooms asking for this, and everybody wants something, and most of what people are asking for is valid, and there's nothing that is overtly harmful or bad that anyone's coming and looking for dollars for. It's a lot of good choices that they have to choose between, and a lot of people are going to get no. So I find committees in general to be always wanting more information. They tend to ask very good questions. They tend to be engaged, particularly in this session, I think, because the level of need was so high, and because they had heard so much from, I would imagine, their constituents, but also from the folks that come in and do their testimonies about what was going on, and about the need for funding, and about the need for action at a legislative level. So again, it was like that this year. The committee was super interested in what I had to say. They asked a lot of questions, and my testimony focused largely on school-based services. I oversee mostly, not entirely, but mostly are part of the agency that provides services in public schools in partnership with mental health. So a lot of the questioning focused on those lines, what kids needed in school, what they could do to support those programs, and tying in, because none of those services happen in isolation, tying in what the supports are in school to what families needed in the home to what was needed in the community. I think the thing about this session is that what they were asking about and what they were talking about is kind of exactly what happened, which I appreciated. It all kind of flowed, which we talked about a little bit in the last episode as well. All of that was very connected, and there was a lot of action, and I think typically they want to. There are other competing priorities that come into play, but this session certainly played out that way. So, a huge thank you to everybody who testified on behalf of the mental health system, the DA system, or for Vermont citizens in general. That it was super appreciated and had a tremendous impact this year.
Absolutely, and well said. And Amy, I know you also testify a lot.
Yeah. So I think it's exciting because the session kind of starts with the governor's budget hearing, and you only get 2 minutes to talk, but it's nice because you're there virtually this year, kind of for a greater chunk of the evening, and you really get to hear the priorities of the state of Vermont. Anybody can come, anybody can testify. And so it kind of starts off really getting to hear, like, these are the things that are important to Vermonters, that are important to the system of care. And we had this year so many staff excited to be a part of the advocacy efforts on behalf of the agency, more so than I've ever seen it in my time. So it wasn't just the legislative committee, it really was this huge effort on behalf of direct service staff and leadership staff at the agency who really wanted to be a part of it, because it always matters, but this felt like such a critical advocacy year. So that was really great. And I agree with Matt, the legislators are always so keyed into the discussion that's happening in committee. I was able to testify in House Human Services and Senate Health and Welfare about the Parent-Child Center bill, our statute, and it's always a little bit, nerve-wracking because you're representing this big thing. But it's also really exciting to be able to talk about the work that you do and why it's important and why your ask is important, and really just highlight what you're doing and why it matters and how it impacts families. So that was really exciting. And I do think it's so different when you go to the State House. There's so much energy, and not being there in person, you don't get a lot of that. But I think the nice thing about the virtual platform is it does allow for better access for people that might not have the ability to go to the State House, or feel intimidated, or not supported by that process, or live really far away. And so really we were able to get a lot more folks in committee testifying, and a lot more families, because they had greater access because of the virtual platform. So it was really exciting overall.
The other thing I think we need to mention, in this state, this is not their full-time job. So to the points that you both have made, is that you have these legislators who are having people, just one after another, come in asking for whether it's funding or some sort of initiative. And they've got to dissolve all that and make decisions. And that, by the way, that's one of the reasons that it is critically important that people do advocate on the behalf of our programs, because otherwise they wouldn't have as much information to make really sound decisions when it comes time to vote. And the other thing I always like to say to people is, they go, well, so-and-so is not on the such and such committee. Maybe they're on the transportation committee or the agriculture committee. They still vote, and they still need to have information so that they can make a decision that, makes sense for what the ask is. So all of that is just terrific. And I agree, Amy, that by having the virtual platform gave so many more people a voice that never had it before, because of one reason or another. Maybe their distance, maybe transportation, maybe daycare. It rattle off the list of why they may not have been able to do it before. So Now, Brady, as we look forward, what are a few areas of growth that you'll be looking at for the Behavioral Health Division entering the legislative session of FY24?
I think all of us here have our wish list, so I'll kind of go through it. But, I think all these points really relate back to the client and their need, and explain a little bit on each of these. So, I think those continued increase, Medicaid increases are very important. And I say that it's for retention and keeping current staff. Because in the CRT population I work with, they have severe and persistent mental illness. These clients are usually in this program for an extended period. And they do become very close with the staff they work with. So staff retention is very important. And it can disrupt a lot of different things when staff leave for these clients.
Yeah.
They have a very long relationship with them. And they trust these staff, So we want to keep that up. And that's why those increases are very important to the CRT population. But I think NCSS as a whole would be very important. Another thing to touch on is the aging population, not only in CRT, but behavioral health in general. The population's aging. So that is very tough. Services need to change a little bit, maybe, some geriatric psych type stuff, and maybe help with the relationships with like nursing homes and stuff. And can anything change in the state? Is there any extra funding for a lot of those programs out there? Because when a CRT client or a client with mental illness ages, the outlook is very tough when they need a nursing home type setting. A lot of nursing homes will not take them because of that diagnosis. So some support or help around that would be great. And as Matt said, maybe also like a DMH, helping out with that kind of stuff, or partnering with legislators in DMH, trying to come up with something to help with that. And then still the one that's going on is, hospital bed wait times. Clients sitting in hospital beds for days to a week at a time. Adult, I know youth also. That's just really not good for their mental health overall. And you can talk to a lot of those clients after that happens, the consumers after it happens, and it's a really traumatic experience. And it might influence later if they're willing to get help again if they're in that space, and that's not what you want to have happening. So, it's definitely a wish list. I know there's been multiple conversations about either geri psych or forensic psych beds, and that would be a long-term kind of thing or solution, but maybe there is something that is needed, and I think the legislators would have a lot to do with that. DMH would too, but the legislators would have a large piece in that. So going to them saying, these wait times are still very long for somebody, and this is how it impacts them. These are the stories we've heard, or even having consumers testify would be very important.
And when you speak of the aging population, Vermont is the second oldest state. So you take that into account. That isn't going to change dramatically, because of the numbers and how our population tends to grow over time, which is at a very slow pace. So certainly programming dedicated will be critically important. And you made the other point that I know we've all the divisions have struggled with, which is the number of individuals in hospitals and ER departments sitting there waiting for a bed. It's very important that we address that as a system of care. No question about that.
And I would, if I could just jump in and sort of make a point that's connected to that for sure. There is a lot of attention, rightly so, on folks who are in crisis, who end up having to be served in emergency departments because they need a very intensive and secure level of care. But very connected to that is the home and community system of service delivery as well. Both before individuals hit that point where they go into crisis, and then once they come out of crisis, there has to be the supports in place to make sure that they don't get back to that point again. That their needs are met coming out of a high crisis situation. And for kids, we've run into a lot lately the need for a place to live. Secure place to live. Whether it's a foster placement or a shared living provider or some kind of residential program, whatever it is. There's that part of the system. Is a huge area of need, I think, as we head towards the legislative session in FY24. And then the workers that support those, the community support workers, the family support workers, counselors, everybody that sort of wraps services around those individuals so they can maintain in their homes, so they can maintain in the community, so they continue to access their home school, all of that kind of stuff takes a lot of effort, and just that is a particular place for attention from the legislature in terms of resources and funding to make sure that that system is stable, both so that individuals aren't hitting a crisis level as often, and they're not heading into things like the ED as often. And so when that does happen, because I think we're all relatively realistic that that's going to take time to reduce those numbers to zero. But when it does happen, and they get through their crisis, that we're able to wrap them appropriately in supports to maintain them, to help them maintain afterwards too.
And again, to go off that point, I think the housing crisis and rental crisis in Vermont does not escape any of our clients either.
Right.
That can put people in a huge crisis state of not having stable housing or no available housing. So I think, help with the legislators just in general with that topic and the governor, I think would help our clients also.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I think that that's connected to our clients, but also our staff. It's really hard to recruit people into these positions that are really critical for everyone that we serve when there isn't housing for people to be able to live here, affordable housing for people to be able to live here or move here from other places. I think, Joe, you could do a whole show on housing. And maybe you should.
Absolutely.
It's important for the clients that we serve, but it's also just as important for the staff who serve our clients. If people don't have places to live, they're not going to move here and be able to work for us to support, this huge population of folks that we support.
Yeah, and we actually did do a show about a year and a half ago on housing, but can certainly do another one, because you're right, it covers across the board the issues that we're facing of not having affordable housing. And it is a crisis, because whether it's staff being recruited and can they afford to live here, clients that we serve, it's universal in that we need to figure out a way to get to the bottom of this. And it's going to take time, and there's a lot of layers to it, and there's a lot of discussion, but we need to get some action in the future and hopefully be creative in ways that we can address this situation. Because without housing, that's kind of like the point one. Without a roof over your head, how do you have a job? How do you keep a job? How do you, start rolling all your life out without a house, or like I said, without a roof over your head? It's very, very difficult. So.
Yeah. And not only that, but we have the housing that we do have, the rents are higher than average.
Yeah.
So what that does is you have this demand of people who would love to live in Vermont, but because the rents are so high, they might not be able to afford it, and that acts as a barrier for them moving to the state, maybe starting a business, maybe influencing the local economy in some way to grow those numbers. You alluded to earlier the fact that we have an aging population. I know that Governor Scott has done taken some action to try and put money out there to influence people to come in, but it's going to be tough without adding more public housing, more affordable housing. And over time, my hope is that we could see those rent rates going down a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Rent as well as buying. They're both extremely
Absolutely.
high. So, Amy, as you look forward to FY24, what are the system and service needs that you're looking to support, and how can the legislature help with that?
Yeah, so like I said in the previous show, we're very active in the legislature. And so this legislative session, we're primarily focused on an increase for our base grant. And so a big part of that is connected to wages for staff. And I know that Brady I think all of us talked about this, is that we need to keep high quality staff to support the populations that we serve. And to be able to do that, we need to be able to pay them livable wages that keep them in these positions. And so we really want to look at that wage parity with the healthcare system. And so we're really focused on that this legislative session with the increase to our base grant. And really, to Matt's point about the system and the home and community-based services and keeping people out of crisis, really funneling dollars into prevention efforts so that families are in a really good standing to be able to weather kind of the next big storm or small storm that comes about. And so it really is looking at prevention efforts, wage parity for staff, and then kind of meeting families where they're at. So we've pushed into a lot of pediatric practices, hoping to push into OB practices by having staff embedded in those practices. And so really looking to the legislature to say, how can we fund those projects to be able to get somebody from the local parent-child center embedded in those practices so we can identify needs for families early on and get them directly connected so that they have a healthy, happy start from the beginning, again, to avoid them hitting that crisis system. So those are kind of the priority areas that we're looking at for this session.
And certainly one of the interesting factors of that is, as we sit here, the election hasn't taken place yet, and there will be a lot of freshman representatives, and so it's going to be an interesting year. So Tim, to get back to the last session though, Bill H720 is a substantial bill for the developmental services system. How does this affect the system of care and the people that we serve?
Absolutely. Bill H720 is a great bill. And what it does essentially is that it sees that participants in systems change their activities, including payment reform, development of resources to comply with the federal home and community-based service regulations. And it puts this information out there in plain language. So that way, the clients that we serve, their families, they have a say in the system of care and the services that they receive. Alongside H720, there was also an unprecedented amount of advocacy that I know Brady and Amy and Matt have touched on. But there was also advocacy for the DS system, and in particular, direct support professionals. So we alluded to last episode, the residential staff that we have, but also community support professionals, direct support professionals who have traditionally and historically just not been paid what they should, not been valued the way that they should. And over time, my hope is that with the wage action bill that just passed, that 8%, it retains the talent that we have. It ensures that the quality of support continues and that the people we serve continue to get their needs met in the best way possible.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah, it is
for,
a big deal.
For intellectual and developmental disabilities, without question.
Yep.
You know, one of the things that I'm hoping that viewers have been able to gain over these last couple of months is just how broad the services are that NCSS provides, because that's the hardest thing to try to convey to people. You know, when somebody says, well, what does NCSS do anyway? And you start rattling off and they get like a glaze in their eyes. But the fact of the matter is that it's an organization, I like to say it's really the fabric of our community, because we do meet people where they're at. We are very much embedded in a variety of community partner scenarios, from schools, which we've been embedded in over 20 years. People don't realize that. The NCSS staff that are walking the halls and that are there, you know, the average parent that walks in the building or whatever doesn't realize that's actually an NCSS staff person that's helping that student, not from the various schools that we're in. Same can be said for the importance of being embedded in primary and specialty care practices, that people who perhaps would not walk outside that building come to our building for services, they will openly get those services in those locations because they're comfortable there. You know, otherwise, so that's a win. Being embedded in law enforcement is a win, because there's a lot of instances that we have been able to ensure don't occur because somebody really was struggling with a behavioral or mental health condition, as opposed to some other condition that law enforcement really needs to take the lead on. So you just look at some of those areas where we have staff embedded and the importance of the work that they do to try to keep our community safe and, once again, help people to live their lives to the fullest. And there are so many programs and services that we as an organization provide to make that happen that I know it becomes sometimes very difficult for people to understand what we do as an organization, because it's very easy for people to think that NCSS means psychiatry, outpatient, and emergency services. And yes, we are all that, but we're that and so much more. And the work that all of you have been doing, and your staffs and others, to help legislators to understand the need and why it's so critically important for our community, just like it is throughout the whole state of Vermont, but certainly we're talking about our catchment area, is to be commended. And, you know, we can't thank the legislators enough for everything that they did during the past session, because, you know, we just want them to truly understand how grateful we are.
Yeah.
That the mental health system of care and the parent-child centers, and, you know, from our youngest residents all the way to the eldest, need to be treated with respect. And there are times that they do need assistance, and we're here for them with that assistance. But there's things that we need as far as tools in our toolbox to be able to make that happen. And one of the most important asset that we have as an organization is our staff.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to, you know, we grow that staff, we train that staff, and then we want to retain that staff member who can do good work for hopefully years to come and not have turnover rates and those sorts of things. Because I think Brady said it earlier, people get connected to those that are helping them. And when that person gets taken out of the equation, that can be a very traumatic moment for that individual. So all of this leads back to, again, us thanking the legislators for everything that they did during the last session. And we can hope that this will continue in future sessions. And I think all of you have displayed a variety of ways that as we look forward into the next session, it's going to be very important. And I think another important factor is when we're talking about with the election, there will be many new faces, and we need to ensure that they understand, you know, the great work that all of your teams do each and every day. So with that being said, this has been part 2 of our discussion about the legislative session from 2021-2022. And I do want to thank my guests again, Matt Habedank, Amy Johnson, Brady Therrien, and Tim Lyman, for sharing their insights on the positive impact of our system of care from last year's legislative session and the look into the future sessions. I also want to thank you, the viewer, for spending time with us again this month. You can learn more about NCSS and all of our programs and services by logging on to ncssinc.org. I'm Joe Helko, and I'll be back next month with another episode of NCSS Here for You.